I think we can overcome objections to the gospel, first of all, by asking people questions. Behind every question is a questioner. And sometimes people throw up objections because it's a smokescreen. Like in a naval battle in the First World War, if you were firing shells at the enemy, you started to make smoke out the funnel to try and hide your ship. And some people do that. The questions are not genuine, they're just trying to kind of cover themselves. But sometimes they are genuine. And Jesus was very careful when people asked him questions. Often he then asked them a question back to try and find, I mean, he was the Son of God, right? But he tried to draw out from them what their thinking was. And a good example would be suffering, for example. People might ask a question about suffering just because it's a kind of academic thing. How can a loving God allow suffering? But they might just have had, a child die a couple of weeks ago. We just don't know. So I think, first of all, to try and find out more about the questioner. Why are they asking it? What's behind that? Then I think to treat each question seriously and to try and answer, if we can, from the Bible, I guess. What I typically do is, if someone asks me a question, I try and, because I'm trying, like a trailer for a film, for a movie, right? You're trying to trail the gospel. So if somebody says to me, all religions lead to God, I would typically say, well, that's a great question. And it's in episode 4, by which I mean chapter 4, like a box set of John's Gospel. Jesus is going to meet someone from another religion. And you'll find it really interesting how he talks to them. Or if somebody says, well, how can a loving God allow suffering? I'd say, well, in episode 11, Jesus is going to deal with someone who is allowed to die. And I think you'll be fascinated by the way in which he's so compassionate to the family, the mourning family of the dead person, and yet also has the power to raise them from the dead. Or a final example would be a very common reaction in the UK is people say, well, I'm not really religious. I don't know if that's an objection or a deflection, but I would say, oh, that's a great point, because in episode 3, Jesus is going to meet a very religious person who thinks they've got everything nailed down to God and that Jesus should be really pleased to see them. But this man, Nicodemus, is going to be sent off with a flea in his ear. So I think often the best way to deal with questions and objections is to bring them back to the Bible and in a way tell them a story from the Bible. Another very common objection is, Christianity is just for good people, it's about morality. And then you could tell them the story of the prodigal son, for example. And there's inherent supernatural power in stories. The other day somebody asked me a question, I was giving a talk, and someone said, are you really saying if there were 2 men and one was incredibly irresponsible, blew their money on drugs, prostitutes, everything, but then at the end they turned back to God, they would be okay, and another person who gave all their money to charity was very respectable, but they didn't follow God, they wouldn't be? I said, well, it's funny you asked me that, because then of course that was the story of the prodigal son, right? So there are many different ways, but I think we always want to, in my experience, watch out for getting people into a kind of academic boxing match where we're punching them and they're punching us. That won't achieve anything. But in a loving and kind way to bring them back to the Lord Jesus, because it's not about us, it's about him. And if our ego and our arguments become the obstacle or something gone wrong. And another thing that people often ask me in the context of studying the Bible together or chatting about the Bible is, well, what if someone asks me a question I don't know the answer to, or they raise an objection I've never heard? Now, part of the reason, the argument there, I would say, is, well, there's lots of apologetic stuff you can do. There are only about probably 15, 20 questions. But sometimes people do ask questions, and then it's okay. It's absolutely okay to say, I don't know. Oh, that's an interesting point. I've no idea. Then go and ask your pastor, go and ask somebody else for help, find a book. Because it's not about us, it's about him. We don't have to have all the answers. And if someone raises a fantastic objection, do some research and go back to them. I found that people like that, actually. They respect it. And if you've established this rhythm of reading with them where you sit and chat every couple of weeks, you can say, that's a great question. Let me come back to you in 2 weeks. And when you've bothered to do that, people are often pleased that you've taken the time and effort to look into things.